ladies and gentlemen. It's show Ukraine, Russia, China on Pod TV. My name is Sasha Star. Our guest today is Dr. Jonathan Lockwood. Welcome to the show, Jonathan.
Thank you, Sasha. Glad to be here as always.
Okay, well, unfortunately, Ivan from Kiev couldn't make it today, but promised to be here on Friday. Okay,
Oh, well, okay. Now, that will be a very propitious day, Sasha.
that's true.
Yes,
Exactly.
indeed. Because according to the latest reports I read, President Trump has said that within 2 minutes, he said within 2 minutes of his meeting, start of his meeting with Putin on Friday, he will know whether or not the Russians are serious. My estimation is it's going to take him a lot less than 2 minutes to realize that the Russians are not serious because the actions of the Russians are showing that they are going to push for everything they're worth prior to the meeting on Friday in order to force, from their perspective, mind you, from their perspective, to force an unconditional surrender. They are trying to force a peace on their terms. And as delusional as that may sound, given the casualties that they've taken so far, it still remains. I still contend that the Ukrainians still hold their destiny completely in their hands. If they unleash a timely counterattack and manage to stop whatever offensive Putin has in mind prior to this Friday.
Actually, Trump on a recent conference, I think yesterday, he made an allegation that Putin's army is so great that if it would follow his plan to invade and take over Kiev in 4 days, it used to be three, I don't know where he got 4 days. However, um, the one or two of his generals decided that the tanks and all the Russian attack, instead of moving on the beautiful highway right into Kiev, they changed directions and moved into some agricultural land, which slowed considerably the advance, and actually it all failed. Jordan, what's your comment on that?
Well, it just tells me that the Russian logistical system is as poor as ever,
Is
and their planning isn't necessarily as good as they claim to be.
So, how insightful is Trump's knowledge of Russian logistics, communication system, as a general's communication? Where did he get this picture that they could have done it in 4 days on a highway? What highway? What kind of highway is there in Ukraine? What are you talking
Yeah,
about?
exactly. You have me mystified there. Yes, I don't know where President Trump got his information. What I can tell you is he got bad information. He got bad analysis, and unfortunately, he acted on that bad analysis.
Yeah, that's true. There are a few other quite interesting. Sometimes uh, I feel that he his format to communicating with his constituencies is a direct talk, similar to what I've just described, rather than going through representatives and Senate and Congress or so on, because that requires a certain level of communications, whether it's how is material being delivered, even vocabulary and many other things. When he
In,
talks directly to his people,
yeah,
he
yeah. Well,
talks his level to his people.
right. What what it shows is that he's not prepared to sit back and analyze and take in the inputs from various advisors, instead preferring to do it unilaterally with the information that he gets, which has its advantages and disadvantages. The advantage, of course, is it enables him to act more quickly and presumably take advantage of emerging opportunities. The disadvantage, of course, is that if you don't get multiple inputs, uh, then you are more likely to make a mistake, or at least a tactical mistake, and then you have to go back and correct yourself, which can involve some dancing and some verbal dancing and maneuvering. But it's interesting to watch, but I would say that the realities of the battlefield are going to convince the realities of the battlefield and of continued Russian intransigence in continuing to act and insisting on their maximalist demands for what amounts to complete unconditional surrender. I mean, let's not. And the Russians don't have. They either show a stunning lack of self-awareness, or an utter ruthlessness and monofocus on attaining, their President Putin's fixed goals of conquering all of Ukraine, as unrealistic as that may be. And because the EU has already let President Trump know that they would not find it acceptable to cede territory to Russia prior to any agreement.
There was something other quite a strange note was in Trump's speech about exchanging territories. So
Exchanging
Ukraine
what?
changing their own territories for some others their own territories. What kind of exchange?
It doesn't appear to be any kind of a exchange that certainly it's not an exchange that Zelensky would agree to. He's not about to agree to that, and there's no real means for the United States to force Ukraine to accept that kind of an exchange. And particularly, again, let's keep in mind that we don't know we can't see all the cards. We cannot see what hidden actions that these three parties might have in mind. Well, we're getting a pretty good idea of Russia. They're going to keep driving ahead until they get what they want, or are forced not to get what they want. And for Ukraine, the hidden card is still, as the Ukrainians have shown in the past, all during the course of this war, the capacity to achieve tactical and operational and potentially operational surprise, to do the unexpected. Remember when President Trump said to Zelensky in that White House meeting, he said, "You don't have any cards." And then Zelensky went ahead and said, "Oh, yes, I do." Yeah. He went ahead and played it. So, and I still anticipate that the Ukrainians have a couple more tricks up their sleeve, that they will be able to surprise the Russians, inflict even more casualties, and and if they continue their campaign of striking Russian infrastructure and striking their logistics systems and wearing down the Russian ability to sustain offensive operations, that is steadily paying off. And I believe that is going to force an eventual Russian halt to their offensive operations. The trick now is, can the Ukrainians exploit that opportunity? They'll have a very small window of opportunity, I predict. They'll have a small window of opportunity to take advantage of the Russian failure of their offensive operations. And if they can do that successfully, then we'll have a more suitable environment for achieving at least a ceasefire, if not an armistice. But the European Union has made it clear they will impose these sanctions. They'll impose these sanctions unless Russia agrees to withdraw from Ukrainian territory. They have established that. So what Russia faces is increased economic sanctions, increased pressure on their economy, diminishing resources. They're not going to get this massive surge in productivity to make up for the massive losses they've taken. So I still see this as a potentially winning end game for Ukraine, provided that Ukraine has both the will and the means to inflict a decisive counterstrike at the right time. Your take?
I think, yes, they have means, they have a will. Zelensky said that without parliament, he cannot even discuss ceding any Ukrainian territories to Russia.
They're asking for something that he has no power to give.
Absolutely. And Trump was irritated by that. So he said, wait a sec. So Zelensky started war against Russia. He didn't need parliament's approval. But now to end the war and give some territory to Russia, he needs approval. What kind of thing is this? This is getting very depressed situation of how you can really negotiate rightful and permanent peace with Russia, with Trump acting as some kind of intermediary. But I even don't think that he is acting as intermediary. He is acting as a proponent of Putin's interests. He wants to have some Geschäft, which means business, dealings with Russia, unlike European partners of Ukraine. They had actually sizable business with Russia about buying oil and gas and resources, just name it. So they forgone all that. No more Russian purchases now for Western Europe. Interestingly enough, US doesn't have any meaningful trade with Russia. The only thing what
Yeah.
I'm aware of, they're buying some Russian uranium and maybe vanadium, maybe some other stuff. But that's about it. It's minuscule. It's almost next to nothing. And yet Trump wants to do some kind of a phenomenal business with Russia or so on. What kind of is it? Is it kind of a
I'm not sure. Well, especially if when you look at it in terms of what Russia has to offer, well, what is Russia's primary export? Oil. What is happening to the price of oil? Well, President Trump, with his policies, is drill baby drill and expanding energy production and all these other things. That's pressuring, dropping the price of oil, and that's in President Trump's interest because he wants to lower prices for the American people, and stimulate his economic growth policies. And what that does is, of course, that simultaneously it's either it simultaneously weakens Russia at the same time as it strengthens the U.S. economic position. So, I don't think he's being incredibly obtuse. I think he's just being very coy about what his policies are actually doing to Russia. He's just not coming out and saying it straight out. So I think it's a fascinating situation to watch. But I think the continued economic pressure, if in fact President Trump's energy policies succeed in dropping the price of energy even further, that will put even more pressure on Russia's economy in an attempt to sustain its war effort, because Russia does not have a global currency that it can just print up more money and go into deficit spending and so forth. They cannot do it, and they need hard currency. They need something to actively trade with, and unfortunately for them, what they have to offer, energy and oil, is not something that the United States needs. It can produce, all the oil it needs, and even drop the price. So this is a fascinating little maneuvering game we have going here.
Well, I noticed that Trump is sending over and over again his personal friend Steve Witkoff to negotiate and talk to Putin. Now, Witkoff is not a professional diplomat. He's
No.
not, I mean, beside real estate, I even don't know what other relevant experience he has. And if that's the case, why he's not sending professionals such as maybe Rubio, maybe some other, even J.D. Vance or whatever, to talk to Putin? Not necessarily in Moscow; it could be done somewhere in the.
If he's sending Witkoff over to discuss economic deals, then it's a useless exercise, because the Russians don't deal in that kind of currency. Their currency is power, and they're a command economy. Not a very efficient command economy, to be sure, but that is what he's dealing with. And so the kind of deal that Witkoff would be trying to negotiate is not one that the Russians either understand, appreciate, or want. So,
but I'm not so sure if Witkoff understands what's being said and what's being portrayed to him, because he was very vague in exactly, okay, so what Putin told you exactly? Oh, he was talking about, well, maybe some territory. Oh, no, it's not territory. I think it was that he is completely useless. But what's happened is, though, that it was a very positive development for Putin, because there was no sanctions released on the August 8th. And believe it or not, Putin, international criminal, convicted by international court, was invited right into United States. And interestingly enough, yesterday, Trump said that, okay, so now he has to meet with Putin in Russia. Supposedly, it was mistake, in an unintentional mistake by Trump, calling Alaska Russia. But actually, it's a Russian narrative because
Yeah.
Russians are
The- the-
saying that Alaska was never sold to the United States. It was leased for 99 years, which is expired, and now they all have to leave Alaska at once, and it's Russian territory. It's a debunk theory which has nothing absolutely in reality with what's happened. What's happened was that Alaska was sold to the United States for, I believe,
$7 million.
something over $7 million.
$7 million. It was called, and they called it Seward's Folly.
Right, right. So
Seward was the Secretary of State at that time, I believe.
So Trump, when he made this supposedly mistake, I don't think that for him it was mistake. I think it was intentional Russian narrative repeated by Trump to have a fun. Okay, here I'm telling you. Okay, we meet in Russia. Not exactly in Russia. It's Alaska. It's copyright.
Trump was saying, here you are in Alaska. Do you want Alaska? You can't have it. Sorry. Just our little joke.
Listen, it's a phenomenal joke. I think hopefully his constituents appreciate his brand of humor and will enjoy it. Let's see.
Yeah. They say, or say it's Alaska. We stole it fair and square. For
Okay, now there was a joint declaration by Europeans and Ukraine regarding this. Negotiations or talks, or I don't know really what it's going to be. You're talking about 2 minutes to understand what Putin is up about. Okay, I'll give it 4 minutes. Time for translation.
Okay. It should not take as long as 4 minutes or even 2. From the initial statements by the Russians, they are not subtle. Subtle is one thing they are not. And it should become very apparent from the moment the Russians begin speaking, it should become well within 2 minutes. Trump and his entourage, his advisors, should be able to clearly see that the Russians cannot be bargained with, and that this is a waste of time.
John, have you never thought that Russian approach reminds very much the Trump's mentor Ray Cohn? Always attack, never get back. All keeps attacking until you win. So don't Russians do the same thing? They are on the attack, never yield.
That's a fascinating analogy. I think, and Roy Cohn, when he was a very rabid anti-communist, and he was absolutely relentless. He applied the same sort of relentlessness to fighting communism as the communists and the Russians followed in their offensive against the West. So you're seeing two sides of the same coin. And so, but Putin and the Russians, they are going just as they did in the Second World War. Of course, they pressed relentlessly forward, even when they had, even before the gates of Moscow. But ironically enough, the only reason the Russians were able to successfully drive the Nazis out of the Soviet Union was because of the United States supplying Ford trucks, among other items of Lend-Lease, to the Russians, which gave them the necessary logistical capability to sustain those offensives and supply them. Because you'll also notice, even with that added logistical capability provided through Lend-Lease, the interesting thing was the Russian offensives, the westward Russian offensives during World War II, as they got closer and closer to Berlin, the offensives became shorter and shorter in duration. Very massive, they would have to build up supplies, but then you have this massive offensive and they push the Germans back, but each offensive got shorter and shorter in duration because they were getting farther and farther away from their logistical bases. And they didn't really have the supply of Ford trucks made up for that deficiency to a significant degree, significant enough to enable them to win the war. but it did not guarantee, it did not fully correct the deficiencies in Russian logistics. So now that the Russians don't have that kind of efficient logistical aid once provided by the United States,
Have donkeys. Don't
yeah,
underestimate
they have
donkeys.
the donkeys. Yes, but it was like what the Russians had without those Ford trucks. They were relying on horse-drawn wagons, and horse-drawn. I mean, I've war gamed that situation with horse-drawn wagons trying to conduct a Russian tactical offensive with horse-drawn wagons. Are you kidding? I mean, it's just very difficult to conduct offensive operations tactically with the Russian army if your logistical base happens to be based on horse-drawn wagons. And they're facing the same problem now in the 21st century. They have not learned, or
Uh,
they either they have not learned or they're unable to correct it.
when you mentioned these trucks that were supplied to Russians under Lend-Lease program, so once the war is over, supposedly all these trucks had to be returned to United States.
Yeah, well,
Must
yeah,
tell you that I'm from Odessa, and in the 60s, I saw several Studebakers on the Odessa streets doing daily movements of goods or
oh
something.
yeah. The Russians were the Russians and Ukrainians say, "Oh, these trucks are so wonderful. We just can't bear to give them up. We just yeah." Okay, well, thank you for the compliment. Well, remind us not to lend you any more trucks.
No, those trucks were really wonderful. They were
Oh yeah,
fantastic job. Now, another thing, what Trump mentioned in that latest speech yesterday, he said that Russia is a phenomenal warriors country. They fight it Napoleon and Hitler, and they won all the wars whatever they participated. Now again, so where are his
they'll
advisors? Why didn't they
basically
remind him of war with Finland, which they lost hundreds of thousands of
yeah,
people?
at
What
least a
about
couple of hundred, at least a
Afghanistan?
couple, yeah, at least a couple 100,000 before,
Yeah,
yeah, before Stalin, just through sheer weight of troops, managed to force Finland to cede the necessary territory around Leningrad that he needed to create a sort of a safety zone between the Finns and the Germans. And of course, they also conveniently left out World War One, which the Russians lost badly. And matter of fact, that those losses helped trigger the Russian Revolution, arguably. And
no,
so,
actually, if you remember, of course you do. First World War, everybody in Entente, everybody won the war except Russia. How Russia could be a part of Entente and manage to lose the war? That's war,
that that
Bolshevik
takes
war.
that takes talent, a weird sort of talent. I'm glad I don't have that talent.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's horrible. So even the wars that Russia was winning, it managed to lose.
yeah,
That's really incredible. That's never
yeah,
happened ever before in the history. It's the
yeah.
first time ever. But so I the last thing what I would like to discuss is that, as I said, Ukrainians and Europeans they voiced their opinion of what should happen as a result of the end of war, and it's still unclear whether there will be present there. Most likely not. Whether they will have any say, most likely not. But if it's there, just Putin and Trump. Same as several times Witko was in Moscow, several times as Trump was on the phone with Putin. What makes this meeting so exceptional compared to everything else? Because there is no plan. What was voiced from Russia, from Ukraine, from Trump, which would make some coherent plan of action. What makes sense? Because this is benefiting Putin only. He is coming on a world stage. He is being received by U.S. president. He's got everything what he wanted politically. Now it doesn't matter if there will be a peace or not peace or anything like that. It doesn't matter anymore because Putin is validated. He is part of the world political situation.
Well, if that's all the value that Putin perceives in this thing, he Putin got what he wanted in terms of symbolic recognition, it kind of reminds me of when, remember during the Cold War, when the oh yes, when during the period of nuclear buildup, when the Soviet Union, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, began rapidly building up their strategic missile force, and it was in 1969 that they had actually caught up, supposedly, to the United States in terms of land-based ICBMs. They just passed it, and were approaching parity in submarine-launched ballistic missiles, again, according to the figures at that time. And President Nixon in 1969 declared that a state of strategic parity now exists between the United States and the Soviet Union. And what that would, to the Soviets, Russians, that was a huge event, because based on my research, what they were declaring was that essentially that the United States had effectively recognized the Soviet Union as equals. They had equal amount of power, and again, based solely upon the nuclear arsenals. And what my research also showed was that there was a very strong correlation between the size of the Soviet nuclear arsenal and their own perceived freedom of action to use their own military power in support of their foreign policy goals. It was very gradual, and very slow and very gradual, but it correlated very closely with how strong or how powerful the Soviet nuclear missile arsenal was or was perceived to be. So that after they achieved parity, that's when you started seeing the Soviet Union using proxy forces in Africa and other places. And this, the use of Soviet military power in support of their foreign policy goals reached its peak in 1979, when arguably you looked at the numbers, and the Soviet Union had kind of a marginal numerical superiority over the United States, at least at that point. And that correlated very closely with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. For the first time during the Cold War, the Soviet Union was using its own military forces in an area outside of its tacitly recognized sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. For the first time, they were using it outside of that sphere of influence. And that represented the peak of the use of Soviet military power during the Cold War. And you noticed after that, they sort of had exhausted themselves and were collapsing, because that collapse was also in part triggered by the subsequent declaration by President Reagan of the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, in 1983. And the Soviets recognized this as their worst nightmare, that Reagan was actually creating a nuclear warfighting capability from their perspective.
And in addition to that, Russians shoot down Korean airliner. And that's when Reagan first ever voiced that Russia is an evil empire.
Right.
It was said right there.
Yeah, Reagan gained the moral high ground and the strategic high ground by declaring the Strategic Defense Initiative. Now, mind you, according to other sources that I saw, in that book, KGB, The Inside Story by Christopher Andrew and Oleg Gordievsky, Gordievsky had said that in April 1985, that Gorbachev had received a report from the KGB that the SDI program would eventually be able to block 90% of Soviet missiles in a first strike. There was no way that the Soviet Union could keep up with this capability. Well, okay, could we have realistically done it at that time? No, because it was, as President Reagan said, it was a research and development program. But the Russians did not believe that. They believed that it was an actual production program to produce systems for neutralizing the Soviet nuclear arsenal. And proof of that was they firmly believed that the Patriot system, as early as 1985, they saw Patriot as a potential anti-missile defense system for defending the continental United States. Now, there is no truth to that, but they were projecting their own paranoia and fear of the potential of American technology to neutralize the Russian nuclear arsenal. And that fear, I argue, continues to this day. That is why both Russia and China fear the Golden Dome. They do not fear its actual deployed capability. What they fear is its potential, if pursued seriously and successfully, to neutralize Russian and Chinese nuclear arsenals, and that would in effect eliminate their status as world powers, as great powers worthy of consideration from their own perspective, because the Russians and Chinese place a great deal more importance and faith in the power of their nuclear missile arsenals than does the United States. For the United States, having a nuclear missile arsenal is an added bonus in addition to the other factors of power which we employ. But that is why Putin brandishes his nuclear arsenal to the maximum extent that he can. He is relying on Western fear of escalation, and that is what he's banking on. And Trump is getting tired of that. So says, okay, either fire those missiles or fold, leave the game. It's going to be interesting to watch. But this Friday's meeting is going to be, as we both agree, a pivotal one, and we will know very shortly whether or not Trump and his team are going to, in fact, recognize within the first couple of minutes whether or not the Russians are really serious.
I hope in the next few days Trump will pay a little bit more attention to Reagan's rhetorics, will remember the evil empire concept, not
right.
chef empire.
Yeah. And remember, Gorbachev tried several times during the Cold War to persuade Reagan to drop SDI, and Reagan refused. And that, essentially, the Soviets spent themselves into bankruptcy trying to counter an imaginary Star Wars system.
Interestingly enough, that about in November of 1988, I was fortunate to meet great Garry Kasparov in Greece, and we spent some time to discuss the international situation and asked him about the SDI project. And he said that Soviet Union, at that time still Soviet Union, had no resources, no technical capacities to do anything even remotely possible as SDI. So therefore he didn't predict the end of Soviet Union, which happened 3 years later, but he said that it's absolutely impossible situation for Soviets to go through, because there is no possible adequate answer to this problem. There is no.
Right. Even if they did, Sasha, okay, so what if they said, okay, we'll build our own strategic defense system and neutralize your nuclear weapons?
Some donkeys, right?
Yeah. We'll neutralize your nuclear with our strategic defense systems. Okay, fine. So both sides build massive strategic defense systems and neutralize each other's nuclear arsenals. Who has the advantage then? The United States, still, because it has a superior economy, superior ability to project power. And Russia, it doesn't have any nuclear arsenal. It won't have a usable nuclear arsenal. That is why the Golden Dome represents such a severe, a destabilizing threat to both Russia and China. It does not. The Golden Dome does not threaten their existence. It threatens their power, which is to them is just about as bad.
It's just anonymous, because without power there will be no existence for these criminals.
Because power is what they live for. Power is what they worship. Power is their God.
Absolutely. Well, there are very few days left before Friday. We'll see how it all develops. Our program on Friday will be before the 2-minute talk of Putin in Alaska, but we'll follow anyway. We'll keep you informed.
We'll look for the smoke signals.
Yeah, that's right, Jonathan. Thank you very much for today's program.
Yeah.
And see you on Friday, same place, same time. And glory to Ukraine. And
God bless America. Yes, and let's throw in Canada there for good measure.
Canada, thank you, and province of Ontario. I forgot.
Oh, you want special blessing for Ontario? Gee,
Yeah.
I wonder who lives there.
There are some people, some good
Yeah.
people. Jonathan, thank you again, and have a great weekend to
You
all
do the same.
our listeners. The same. Bye bye, everybody.